My guest today, William Koenig, his newest book, Revealed: Obama's Legacy. Bill has been a White House correspondent for 15 years. He is the president of Koenig World Watch Daily, and he publishes weekly Koenig's Eye View from the White House. Perhaps he's best known to some of you listeners as the author of Eye to Eye, Facing the Consequences of Dividing Israel. And Bill, couldn't think of a better day to have you on the air than this Thoroughly Jewish Thursday on our broadcast today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. Great to be with you.
There's a lot that we know that is open and revealed. I mean, anyone can watch the news. Anyone can hear what Secretary of State Kerry has said. Anyone can read what Prime Minister Netanyahu has said in response. But there are certain things happening behind the scenes, and that you'd have more access to this being a Washington insider. So first, on the broad spectrum of things, is it any surprise to you that the events of the last week have taken place with UN Security Council resolution and with John Kerry's speech? Is any of this a surprise to you?
No, it isn't, Michael. And I went into great detail in my book that you just mentioned, Revealed: Obama's Legacy. One of my chapters was on Israel and the Middle East and the condition that the Middle East has been left in with this eight-year president, two-term president. And, you know, they do positive things, but then again they do things such as the Iran deal, such as doing nothing in Syria, and such as saying ISIS is a JV team that creates a lot more problems. So you have the good, along with the money that they gave to Israel, which is really an extension of what previous presidents have given in this new $39 billion 10-year program. But then again, they do other things that make the area, the neighborhood, extremely complicated and even more dangerous.
All right, so President Obama, 2008, speaking at AIPAC as a candidate in June, did make clear that he advocated the two-state solution, just as President Bush did before him and President Clinton before him. He did pledge certain aid, and he's given that aid. There's been military benefit to Israel. There's been intelligence benefit. Certainly, America has been a friend to Israel when compared to other nations on the planet. That's clear. And yet there's been a very icy relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the average perception in Israel is that Obama has been hostile to Israel. Is that, in your view, because of his sympathies to Islam, being raised part of his life in Indonesia, registered as a Muslim when he was growing up? Is he more sympathetic to Islam than other presidents have been, hence, even as a friend of Israel, less sympathetic to Israel?
Without a doubt. I also, one of my chapters in my book, a Muslim apologist, I've reviewed every speech he's made, every major speech he's made in Turkey, in Cairo in 2009, his speech to a mosque here in Baltimore in 2016. I call him a Muslim apologist. He is much more favorable to Islam in his speeches, and the addresses that he's given are incredibly detailed in terms of, I should say, incredibly revealing, because he is much more comfortable speaking about Islam. And the other thing that burdens me as a believer and many other Christians is the fact that we have Christians being persecuted and slaughtered for their faith throughout the Middle East, and he shows hardly any emotion, and realistically no emotion or no concern, or doesn't make that a main issue, but he has a great concern about bringing more refugees from the Middle East and Northern Africa into the United States.
Right. So along with the UN doing so little and saying so little about the slaughter of Christians and the atrocities in Syria, it is interesting that President Obama seems much more interested in not offending Muslims, whom he would see as primarily moderate, much more interested in not offending them than in dealing aggressively with radical Islam and Islamic terror. What happened with some of his gutting of law books or FBI manuals, things like that? We've read reports that words having to do with Islam were systematically removed, which would then really handcuff these law enforcement agencies from doing things. Is that an accurate report?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have a friend that used to be involved with Homeland Security, and he revealed some things that were, along that line, that were very specific, that came from the White House. and worked its way to Janet Napolitano when she was head of Homeland Security, people, people at the Pentagon, that this is the way they were supposed to talk about Islam. Don't emphasize radical Islam. And yes, it's a total watered-down version of the serious threat that we have here in the United States with radical Islam. So that's absolutely true. Plus, there were 7 or 8 members of the Muslim Brotherhood that have worked their way into positions of influence within the Obama administration and other cabinet positions, which also is not favorable to those of us that want to see the true message of radical Islam exposed and called it for what it is.
Right. So, again, even if in many ways he would say, yes, we remain friendly to Israel and we stand with Israel, and he's taken actions that would show that, because of his other sympathies, because of other friends in the Middle East. People raise questions about George W. Bush and his friendship with Saudi Arabia and how did that affect his judgment. These are all fair questions to ask. But in this case, it goes deeper. I've never believed that President Obama was a Muslim, but a Muslim apologist, yes. Even his 2009 speech talking about things like the Quran being revealed. I mean, that's Islamic talk, is it not?
Absolutely. They mentioned that Thomas Jefferson had a copy of the Quran to that Egyptian and actually the world Muslim audience. That June 4, 2009 address was carried throughout the Muslim world. It was a speech from one of the oldest Islamic centers, universities. I think it was about 1,000-year-old center there, and he had members of the Muslim Brotherhood in the front row there, even to the anger of President Mubarak of Egypt at that time. But that was a message to the entire Muslim world that Thomas Jefferson honored the Quran to the extent that he had a copy of the Quran at the White House. And the main reason Thomas Jefferson had a copy of the Quran was he and John Adams were trying to figure out what makes these Barbary pirates tick. I mean, these are Muslims, so I need to know more about them, so let's study the Quran because this book is obviously influencing them.
Yeah, and some of the sympathies that they expressed in terms of what was happening in Tripoli, Libya, with some of the pirate issues were anything but sympathetic towards Islam. Exactly.
And I think that's the thing, is we need to decipher what he says, how he says it, and the purpose of what he says to fully understand his thinking. One great point here is he told the Saudis, who are petrified of a nuclear Iran, believing that Israel will be first and they will be the second because of this long-time hatred between the Saudis and the Sunnis, the Shiites of Iran. So you have the Sunni Saudis and the Shiite Iranians that do not like each other. And, after the Iran nuke deal, he basically told the Saudi leadership that you need to get used to having 2 significant powers in the Middle East. You're Sunnis, you're a majority of the Middle East, and then also acknowledging the fact that Iran has a right to be in this neighborhood and have an influence as well.
Yeah, again, things unfolding in ways that many have predicted, many were concerned would happen. And, Bill, I just wrote an article that we'll post a little later today. And in it, I went back to the 2008 speech in AIPAC and contrasted some of what he said there with what's happening now and what's happened over the last 8 years. But ironically, he said this: as president, I will work to help Israel achieve the goal of 2 states, a Jewish state of Israel and a Palestinian state, living side by side in peace and security. And I won't wait until the waning days of my presidency. Ironically, in the waning days of his presidency, he's taking very ugly parting shots at Israel.
Yeah, there's a big issue there for sure, Michael. And I think the other part of the fact is that John Kerry has extended so much effort in trying to make a peace deal in Israel. And he has been very mad at Israel. He said, if you don't make peace with the Palestinians, you have the risk of a third intifada. He said, if you don't do this, you're going to be delegitimized in the international community. He also mentioned the possibility of having boycotts with behind the scenes. I understand that he had some influence on the European boycott of products made in Judea and Samaria. And also the fact is you don't want to be considered an apartheid state. So when John Kerry doesn't get his way, he creates more problems. And when he first got involved in this 4 years ago, he used old plans that had already been unsuccessful.
All right, tell you what, we'll stop right here. My guest, Bill Koenig, his most recent book, Revealed, Obama's Legacy. We've got a lot more to talk about on this Thoroughly Jewish Thursday broadcast.
It's The Line of Fire with your host, Dr. Michael Brown, your voice of moral, cultural, and spiritual revolution. Here again is Dr. Michael Brown.
In fact, this administration has been Israel's greatest friend and supporter, with an absolutely unwavering commitment to advancing Israel's security and protecting its legitimacy. On this point, I want to be very clear. No American administration has done more for Israel's security than Barack Obama's.
Those are the words of Secretary of State John Kerry in his 72-minute speech on Israel yesterday. My guest, Bill Koenig, author most recently of Revealed: Obama's Legacy. Bill, what's your reaction to those words from our Secretary of State?
Well, Michael, just before the break, John Kerry has been so motivated to be the guy that delivers this peace deal. He had the attitude when he first took the position as Secretary of State that he believed that, in his egotism, believed that the only reason there hadn't been a peace deal in the last 20 years because he hadn't been working on it. And seldom do I see the Israeli left and the Israeli right media agree that he has done a lot of things and made a lot of mistakes that have only made the situation much worse. And I also mentioned those basic threats to Israel, which has created an even more difficult thing for Israel and the international community. It has helped give fuel to the BDS movement, and it has brought Israel into this uncomfortable position here at the UN, the Security Council, of now basically having another UN Security Council call any legitimate settlement community in Israel, when we say legitimate from our perspective, that the settlement community are living on occupied land, illegal land, and this really burdens and makes it much more difficult for Israel going into the new year.
Yes, I've been commenting on all those issues, of course, through the week, and figure this one out. How is it then that East Jerusalem is illegally occupied territory, and yet candidate Obama promised AIPAC in 2008 that Jerusalem will be the undivided capital of Israel, and then John Kerry yesterday said that there will be two capitals in Israel for Israel and the Palestinian state, both in Jerusalem. How's that all work?
Well, unfortunately, the guy that the co-chair of Barack Obama's campaign back in 2008 was the president, Rosie. He was a president of AIPAC. And this was somewhat of speaking to Rosie as he's president of AIPAC, and also to the Jewish money and the Jewish genius that helped get him elected, David Axelrod and a few others. So, and unfortunately those things change, and, a lot of presidents or a lot of potential presidents say they're going to move the embassy to Israel or move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem when they're running for office, and once they get in office, they start backtracking on that, and as well as that example you just used in 2008.
Yeah, and of course, President Bush backed away from it, just canceling it for security reasons. However, often it had to be, every 6 months or something, and then President Obama continued it. And someone made the comment about Donald Trump. It's like, look, everybody talks about doing it, but nobody's actually going to do it. It'd be crazy to do it. And so why make the promise? Again, many politicians make many statements and then go back on them later on. We're just watching now as it's happening with President Obama and Israel. Let me ask a question in terms of something you focused on for some years. You felt, after doing systematic research, that there were clear parallels with America mistreating Israel in some serious way and something calamitous happening to America. Now, some have theological questions, and how does that work, and don't innocent people suffer? Those are all fair questions. We just won't get into them right now. In my mind, I would have had to research every calamitous event in America and then see were there parallels, were there not parallels, how often did this happen. But it got my attention enough that when Israel, under American pressure, was forced to evacuate Gaza, literally uproot thousands of Israeli families and put them in literal refugee camps within their own country, I remember thinking, what's going to happen are there going to be consequences? And, of course, next Katrina hits us, and now tens of thousands of Americans are homeless, and many people wondered about this. So you've written about it, you've documented it, you've followed it. You can defend that thesis much better than I can. But when you see something like this happening, what are you thinking? Now, we've got an incoming president who says he's going to reverse whatever he can reverse and things will be different. But from your perspective, having observed this for years now, what do you feel when you see our administration do these things?
Well, I look at what happened this year. In my book, originally, Eye to Eye, Facing the Consequences of Dividing Israel, I had over just under 60 major catastrophic record-setting U.S. events that happened usually the same day or within 24 hours, some cases 48 hours, of U.S. pressure on Israel to divide their covenant lands, such as Judea, Samaria, and East Jerusalem. And I noticed the greater the pressure on Israel to comply, the greater the corresponding catastrophe. We had the perfect storm that was sending 30-foot waves into President Bush's home in Maine in 1991. We had 17 days before 9/11. President Bush was working with Crown Prince Abdullah on a major address that he was going to give to the UN. They finished the work on 9/10. He was going to call for a two-state plan, something his dad or Clinton would have never done. And then Katrina, the mention there, Michael, was within a few hours after President Bush congratulated Ariel Sharon on this courageous evacuation of 9,500 Jews from 24 settlements in Gaza and Samaria. We had this tropical depression form near the Bahamas, kind of out of nowhere, which is very unusual. Usually they're deeper into the Caribbean or off the west coast of Africa, but this just developed within a few hours of Bush making that statement and became the biggest disaster in U.S. history. It was a $200 billion event. When you look at the parallels of how things were being explained in Israel, of the eviction of Jews from their homes, you could look at the same parallels of what happened when we had the southern Gulf Coast area of 90,000 square miles impacted by this storm. So the parallels were very significant. And I'm updating the book right now to cover the 8 years of Obama's time in office. We got 35 or so events. We had 6 events this year. We had Winter Storm Jonas. We had, when the Golan Heights was at risk, we had massive floods in Texas. And then we had Hurricane Matthew that happened right at the time of Shimon Peres's death, and the White House saying that Israel's not part of Jerusalem and making a public statement on that. And then what has happened, interesting, since Kerry's speech, well, actually since the UN decision, we've had over 700 tremors in California and Nevada. And yesterday, just before Kerry's speech, we had 3 earthquakes on the California-Nevada border in the 5.7, 5.6, and 5.8 area. And then right after he spoke, a 4.1 quake in the San Bernardino County area. So, it depends on the pressure, Michael, how it works out, but the pattern has repeated itself ever since 91.
Yeah, I cannot wait to see the new edition of your book. I'm going to look at that very carefully. Friends, look at it, examine it, give it thought. Is God speaking through all this? Look at the evidence. Hey, friends, if you appreciate what we're doing, remember we are listener-sponsored. Your year-end gift would be a tremendous blessing to us. Go to Ask Dr. Brown, askdrbrown.org. Click Donate.
Now I must express my deep disappointment with the speech today of John Kerry. A speech that was almost as unbalanced as the anti-Israel resolution passed at the UN last week.
The words, of course, of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu regarding Secretary of State John Kerry's speech yesterday. My guest, Washington Insider journalist William Koenig, his most recent book, Revealed: Obama's Legacy. Bill, Prime Minister Netanyahu immediately after the UN Security Council vote said that America was behind the resolution itself, helped craft the resolution. When there were challenges to this, Israeli Ambassador Ron Dermer said, we have rather ironclad evidence. And since then, an Egyptian paper has released purported transcripts of a meeting with John Kerry and Palestinian leader Saeb Erekat discussing the very resolution. I have a clip from several months ago with a political pundit talking about this specific resolution being one of the options that the Obama administration is discussing. Yet the president's people are denying any complicity in this. From your vantage point, what's your information tell you?
I totally agree that they were working behind the scenes. And Netanyahu, and as Ron Dermer said last night on TV on Fox, he said, he's not going to say this. Prime Minister Netanyahu is not going to say this unless we have the facts. And he even called Ben Rhodes master of fiction, to paraphrase what he said. It's ironclad. I don't think there's any doubt about it, Michael. They have the information. I do know for a fact, I have a friend from New Zealand who also covers Australia, and he said that Kerry was in Auckland, New Zealand, or actually Wellington, New Zealand, on November 13th, meeting with the leaders of New Zealand. And we know for a fact that some of the conversation was about New Zealand's role in this, if they needed a point man or a front man in this process. So I don't think there's any doubt at all. I think they're wise to pass it on to the next administration, Trump administration, who seems extremely favorable to Israel and are committed 100% to moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And I think it's a wise move, but I definitely think they have the information they need.
Yeah, if you can tell us this in less than 2 minutes, great. Otherwise, we'll pick it up on the other side of the break. But when you look at the nations that ended up sponsoring the resolution, New Zealand, Senegal, Venezuela, you look at why? What incentive did New Zealand or say Senegal have to do this? Why would they care?
I don't know that, because I know John Keyes, who just stepped down as Prime Minister of New Zealand, is even Jewish, and I don't know. When you look into these things, you'll find out for one reason or another why they're so committed to it. But I've been very surprised that New Zealand has been so committed to this for so long. I don't know whether they've been put up to it, whether some favor was offered, if they were going to do something in this line. I just don't know. If it's a Middle Eastern country, yeah, you could see that. The other thing is the French have been really pushing a UN Security Council resolution on Israel and the settlements and a peace conference for the last couple of years. And part of that problem is they have 6 million Muslims in their country and have a big problem with Islam in their country. So I think that's one of the motivating factors. But in New Zealand's case, I just don't know why Senegal would do something like that.
Yeah, very, very, very puzzling. And of course, the Netanyahu administration has made it very clear that there will be consequences for this. All right, we'll be back with my guest, William Koenig. His most recent book, Revealed: Obama's Legacy. We want to get in depth a little bit more about what's happening with America and Israel. And we'll take some of your calls on this too. 866-348-7884.
This resolution itself is a resolution that effectively will call for boycotts and sanctions against Israel. That's the language of the resolution, to ask states in their relevant dealings with Israel to make the distinction between pre-67 Israel and Israel beyond the 1967 lines. What does that mean? People will use this resolution to stir the pot for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, and to bring Israeli soldiers and maybe even Israeli citizens to the International Criminal Court.
That is Israeli Ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, talking about the implications of the Security Council resolution that America apparently helped craft and put forward, and then stood out of the way to make sure that it went forward without a hitch. And again, it not just says building the settlements is wrong, but the Palestinians shouldn't use violence either. So, statement to both. It not only says that, but it effectively says that the Jewish Quarter of Jerusalem is illegally occupied territory, that when President Obama prayed at the Western Wall, he was praying at illegally occupied territory. And Ambassador Dermer lists other consequences that could come out of this. My guest, Washington Insider journalist and author William Koenig, his newest book, Revealed: Obama's Legacy, has been joining us the last 30 minutes. Bill, is Ambassador Dermer overstating his concerns? Is there a reason that so many in Israel are saying this is terrible, or is it over the sky's falling, Chicken Little, and it's really not that bad.
No, he's absolutely correct. It has gotten much worse in the last 4 years. You know, it was interesting, Michael, when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, she brought in George Mitchell to do the peace work. She knew how difficult it was because 8 years Bill Clinton had been involved with the process. So I think she only went to Israel one time in that 4-year period. Kerry has been absolutely obsessed with delivering this deal. He's used old, failed plans. In some ways it's like he was on another planet for 7 years and came back in with all these great ideas that had already failed. And and it's also rare when you have, former Ambassador U.S. Michael Oren stating publicly that, please, John Kerry, stay home. We don't need help in you negotiating between Israel and Hamas during that war 2 summers ago. I mean, unfortunately, when John Kerry goes to the Middle East, whether it's being ineffective in the Syria ceasefire talks or whether it's his involvement with the Iran nuke deal, or with his excessive involvement with the Land for Peace process in Israel for the last 4 years, it's left us at this point right now where BDS, the divestment, the delegitimization movement, what's happening in college campuses around America are much worse because of what has happened over the last 4 years by Kerry and Obama, but specifically Kerry's efforts.
So in other words, Israel can say, we defy this resolution, and we're going to keep building settlements. Friends of Israel in America, and then incoming President Trump could say this is a resolution that we reject, but the rest of the world, and then much of public opinion throughout America, is heavily influenced by this, and now just adds to this picture of evil Israel going on with their aggressive policies. What about the argument, though, that Prime Minister Netanyahu's current administration is farther to the right of any previous administration, and that while the settlements are not the primary obstacle to peace, they're an ongoing provocation against peace? What about that argument?
Well, the settlements, it's however it's spun, and unfortunately, a majority of the media in Israel's to the left, and they believe that any bit of settlement construction is a threat to future peace with the Hamas-led Palestinian Authority. I've even told a couple of those guys that work for Haaretz, I said, when they were blasting Netanyahu 4 years ago for not making peace with Assad and giving up the Golan Heights to Syria, I said, are you guys crazy? You got to be kidding. The most important defensive area of Israel, and you want to give it to Assad? Well, look what's happened in Syria the last 4 plus years, almost 5 years. And, same thing with Judea and Samaria. You know how important those mountains are to Israel's security in Samaria and Judea. And to give that up to a Palestinian-led government that's led by Hamas, that does not acknowledge Israel's right to exist, the whole peace process should have been stopped from the first time terrorism began in Israel. But they've wanted to appease and appeal to the international community that we just want to be a good neighbor here. We just want to be an important part of the international community. So reluctantly, they've gone along with it, and it's created a situation we have today.
Now, in Caroline Glick's book on a one-state solution, she begins it as someone who was close to Prime Minister Netanyahu and is a leading journalist in Israel today.
Absolutely.
But she begins her book by explaining why a two-state solution is completely impossible, cannot happen. Then, of course, since you really have to have Gaza as a nation by itself, the way it is now, you're almost talking about a three-state solution. But her argument, and increasingly prevalent argument today, okay, let Gaza be its own country, whatever, and we'll have one state with Israelis, Palestinians living side by side, as happens now, but except open to all Palestinians in Judea, Samaria, the so-called West Bank. And she argues that you can maintain Jewishness, you can maintain a Jewish majority, and hence a Jewish state. By doing it, of course, you have endless problems and questions with that. What's the national anthem going to be? Are Palestinians going to sing Hatikva? And things like that.
Right.
But Secretary of State Kerry yesterday said that if you want to have one state, it can't be both Jewish and democratic. It's got to be one or the other. Whereas two states, by design, this is the Jewish state, and it's majority Jewish, and Palestinian state, that's Palestinian. They can be whatever they want, Muslim or whatever. They can both be democratic, but the way the vote's going to go. Is it possible to have a one-state solution that is both Jewish and democratic?
Well, first of all, the demographic numbers that said that Israel would one day be a minority in their own country are just false. There's been Yorm Ettinger and others have done demographic studies with some of the universities there in Israel, and that's just a false narrative. Secondly, there's three areas there in the West Bank, such as Judea and Samaria. That's A, B, and C. A is fully given over to the Palestinians. They have full control over A. Area B, Israel still has a security interest there, but all the property has been given to the Palestinians. Area C is very important. That's 61% of the West Bank. And that's what Naftali Bennett and other Israelis in the Likud have called for that area to be annexed for their own security purposes and for the fact that Israel's had a 3,000-plus year relationship with this land. That's their plan. Other than that, I just, giving up any additional land to the Palestinians at this point, and the reality of the fact that the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, does not get along with Hamas, that horrible civil war they had in Gaza, they don't get along. And the only time when they have a unity government, it never succeeds because it's only for public perception, but it won't work. So realistically, Gaza is Hamas's. Fine, keep that. And Area A and B would be fine for a Palestinian state because it's already been given to them. The question, Michael, would come down to C. The international community wants to see that, and even more so in East Jerusalem given to the Palestinians. So that's the risk going forward, and that's why Netanyahu's government is becoming more and more right-wing because they see the risk of giving up Area C, which is a large portion of Samaria.
And when President Obama was candidate Obama, again, in his AIPAC speech, he talked about flying by helicopter, looking at Israel's borders, seeing how thin and slender the country was. And yet, back in 2011, and then it's resurfaced since then, talk about going back to pre-1967 borders, which would make Israel at its narrowest 9 miles wide and completely indefensible against hostile neighbors. Do you think that there'll be one more push for that by this administration?
No, I think they've said that they're not going to do anything now. They are, and this is Ben Rhodes. They've got so much blowback from the Democrats and the Republicans on Capitol Hill that they have stated in the last 24 hours that they will veto any additional UN resolution that happens between now and January 20th. And I think another interesting irony is Russia said yesterday that they favor Israel and the Palestinians negotiating directly and not favoring additional resolutions. And I think the irony to that is the fact that the United States is going to slap on sanctions on Russia. Matter of fact, the news is out right now. They're forcing 35 Russian diplomats to leave within 72 hours. So the timing of that, Michael, it's pretty significant that they have to, 32 plus, have to get out of the United States in 72 hours over the hacking thing. But I love the timing because Russia is not willing to cooperate with Kerry at the UN regarding Israel, especially when they're getting ready to have their diplomats forced out of the United States. So that was a Genesis 12:3 timing, I think, for that
really?
Perspective.
Yeah, and then, you go back to the founding of Israel, and Russia casts a vote for it. So amazing to watch history unfold in front of us. Hey, Bill, thanks for all your great work. What's the website where people can follow you?
Website is watch.org. It's watch.org.
Awesome. Keep up the great work. Look forward to talking with you again.
Look forward to it. Thank you, Michael.